Good evening, and thanks for coming on a snowy night. I'm Robert Kaufman. I'm the visiting professor in conservative thought for the year. And part of the benefits of this program is I get to bring in top-rate people nationally to enlighten the People's Republic of Boulder. Tonight is no exception. We are blessed to have Paul Carisse, who is no stranger to Colorado. For 17 years, he taught at the Air Force Academy here in Colorado Springs. Paul's currently the director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Paul is the editor of many fine books and the author of two outstanding books. 2003, University of Chicago published his The Cloaking of Power, Montesquieu, Blackstone, and the Rise of Judicial Activism. And his most recent book that I think just came out in paperback in January, originally published in 2016 on Cambridge University Press, is especially timely. Democracy and Moderation, Montesquieu, Tocqueville, and Sustainable Liberalism. Usually academics are either irrelevant or out of date. What's remarkable about this excellent book is that Paul was ahead of the curve. This book began way before Donald Trump was even a blip on the horizon and the acrimonious, angry politics of 2016. And what Paul has done is put in historical perspective the difficulty we have always had in striving for balance and civility, which is something the Founding Fathers consciously sought to achieve, deriving much of their insight from Montesquieu, and it's also a subject that Tocqueville wrote about in the book. Is not only of enormous theoretical significance, but practical significance as well. Paul is trying to help us, and we certainly could use it, restore the robustness of that tradition of moderation that the founders considered essential for the Constitution to work in practice. Paul was educated at Middlebury for undergraduate, Boston College. I'll mention it even though my daughter went to Boston University, and the rivalry is sort of the Hatfields and the McCoys on steroids. And Paul is also a Rhodes Scholar, and he has held fellowships at Harvard, at the prestigious James Madison Center at Princeton. So please welcome a national scholar and a great teacher and someone who has instituted a program like this, even more so permanently at Arizona State. Please welcome Paul Carisse.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Thank you. This will be a disappointment. I can't really live up to that. So it's all downhill, but that's a good skiing metaphor for Boulder. Thank you, Bob, and thank you also to Bob Pasnow and the Center for inviting me, and Alex Holmgren, who is not here because she has a new member of her family. So thanks for the hospitality and the invitation. And as Bob Kaufman mentioned, it's great to be back in Colorado. And my wife is here, and two of our longest friends from our Colorado days are here. It's also great to be part of this bold experiment, the Chair in Conservative Thought and the Center for Western Thought and Civilization and Policy. It's a good time to be experimenting in higher education, so I'm glad to be part of that. So my topic is moderation and a philosophy of moderation and America, and I thought I would begin with two facts about our situation here at University of Colorado Boulder. First, we're in the Centennial State, named after its founding date, 1876, looking back to 1776, and therefore the Declaration of Independence. And then we meet here on President's Day in 2018, a day named not in honor of all of our presidents, but two in particular, two great presidents, Washington and Lincoln. So my challenge is to suggest to you that the Declaration of Independence, which is very bold, and Washington and Lincoln, who are not average, are moderate, and to change our thinking about moderation. The Declaration of Independence was bold, as if seen as a product of Enlightenment philosophy. It's actually calling for openly for armed struggle, but I'm going to argue that it was a product of a philosophy of moderation. Same with George Washington and Lincoln, two great figures, ambitious figures, exceptional figures, and commanders in war who killed and presided over killing. And I'm going to argue that they embody a philosophy of moderation. So we have time for questions at the end if you're not persuaded at all by this argument. So moderation does not mean simply centrism or just seeking compromise or just tacking for a position. I'm going to propose instead an older view of moderation that's now mostly forgotten and even, in fact, criticized as justly forgotten. It's an embodiment of an older view of virtue, of philosophical and political virtue. Moderation in the Western tradition of political philosophy is a virtue of balance, of balancing and reconciling important principles, and of avoiding extremes, particularly extremes toward which human nature and politics tend. So moderation seeks not merely a middle position or centrism, but the higher and better middle. The French term for it, which is important for the philosophers I'm going to discuss today, is the juste milieu, a just or right center position. And the long-standing term from Greek and Roman philosophy is the golden mean, not just any mean, but the golden mean. I want to take account of our context in another sense, this one not so happy, to think about American politics today, which, as Bob mentioned, is not healthy. It's not defined by seeking consensus in a high middle ground or seeking a common good, nor is it defined by leaders who are seeking high-minded compromises of the sort needed in our very complicated system of politics with its multiple branches and parties. Instead, we have a politics of polarization, of angry, constant campaigning and electioneering, never a pause for governing, never a pause for sober debate that would look away from extremes and seek a higher common ground to address our national problems or challenges. Another bad element of our situation today, partly as a consequence of polarization, is that public confidence in our institutions and major professions is at very low levels, probably the lowest in living memory. Gallup and Pew and other national polling organizations register that only the military profession ranks above 50% in public confidence. And the military profession in America is an admirable profession, but for a self-governing republic, that's not a very healthy sign if that's the only institution that has widespread support. So these facts suggest that the state of our union is not good, and in fact, our constant electioneering doesn't produce any winners in any permanent sense, any durable, constructive sense. We're all losing, in a sense, and certainly there's no sense of a national common good. And I should add, since Bob mentioned Donald Trump, that Donald Trump is not the cause of this in any way. His demagoguery, his anger, his neo-Jacksonian populism, it's a basic fact of 2016 that the two most extreme and angry political candidates dominated in the presidential nominating contest. Not just Donald Trump, but also Senator Sanders, an avowed socialist seeking, as he openly called it, a political revolution. So neither Trump nor Sanders were even members of the parties that they sought to hijack. They're extreme each in their distinctive ways, but together they embody what is immoderate or extreme about our politics. Just a few other depressing realities. We are dominated by what's called negative partisanship, that people define or ally with a party not so much for what it stands for, but because they hate people in the other party. And we're also defined by self-sorting into information bubbles or in confirmation bias bubbles, in where we get our sources of information, who we talk to, what we listen to. Our political dysfunction suggests to me that instead of being fixated on disgust with and resistance to President Trump or to any other particular figure, instead we should be looking for systemic causes of this dangerous condition. And if we assume, as is reasonable, that there's a Frankenstein's monster out there that is not just a random occurrence but has human causes, then there's probably a Dr. Frankenstein back there who unwittingly produced such an extreme political figure. If you're liberal or progressive, the monster is Donald Trump. If you're conservative, maybe the monster is Senator Sanders or somebody else. These observations lead to my next proposition, that while there are several causes for our broken politics, our extreme politics, one we mostly overlook is perhaps the most important, that we have been deficit spending our civic and constitutional culture for at least a century. And so now our constitutional and civic capital is so depleted that while the constitutional institutions or hardware remain standing, Americans mostly are incapable of using them properly. Both our elites and the broader citizenry mostly lack the ideas and civic habits and civic virtues necessary to properly sustain our constitutional order, our free polity. And since we're in Boulder, which is sort of Silicon Valley North, I'll switch to from a financial metaphor to a tech metaphor. In the past century, we thought we could keep our constitutional hardware, but could completely change the operating system software or firmware to produce any apps we wanted from it. So in the spirit of Socrates and in a place of higher learning, I'm here to be the gadfly and propose that universities are part of the problem. Particularly the progressive liberalism of the past century is one cause of America's polarization and political dysfunction, because it denounced and then ignored the philosophical tradition of moderation, especially of the moderate Enlightenment tradition, as I'll call it. Montesquieu being at the root of it, and then several important philosophers and thinkers he influenced: Adam Smith, Edmund Burke, and then in the American vein, the Federalist, and then Tocqueville looking back on all of it, America and the moderate Enlightenment. Progressive liberalism in the past century ignored the philosophy that undergirds our constitutional and political order. So, my provocative thought is Dr. Frankenstein is, in part, progressive liberalism, and especially Woodrow Wilson and John Dewey and their heirs, which criticizes this moderate and constitutionalist thinking as backward or dated, or certainly anti-democratic. And because our two clever doctors and others couldn't change the hardware of our constitutional system, they tried to change the software. In the new political science, Dr. Wilson and Dr. Dewey declare to us there is no need to seriously study the old political philosophy, which explains why we have a separation of powers, or federalism, or limits on democracy, or populism, or majority rule. Instead, we should just run a new progressive and democratic software through the old constitutional hardware, and everything would be better. What could go wrong? So to turn now from diagnosis to a suggested remedy, the great moments in our American political order are instead profiles in moderation, and we need to study them and try to emulate them. I mentioned the Declaration of Independence. It's bold, but it's not extreme. It's moderate because it blends and reconciles and balances Enlightenment philosophy about individual natural rights with three other traditions of thought. First, biblical ideals about a divine mind and providence. There are 4 references to a divinity. Second, the Anglo-American common law tradition of constitutionalism and its view about accumulated legal wisdom. And third, classical Republican ideals about civic duties and the common good. The final words of the Declaration, after all, are that we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. We need to recover these kinds of resources, this understanding, in a better and more substantive liberal education in our universities. And that, in turn, should inform a more substantive and moderate civic education for our leaders and our citizens. And this is not the stuff of utopia or just grand theory. America has done this before. That's one reason, for example, I don't hold the pessimistic view of my friend Patrick Deneen in his recent book, Why Liberalism Failed, a professor at Notre Dame. Patrick argues that liberal democracy in America is inevitably doomed because modern liberalism itself was contradictory or unsustainable from the beginning. Nor do I agree with the anti-American critique and pessimism of two Harvard political scientists, Levitsky and Ziblatt, in their recent book, How Democracies Die. Because while their kind of comparative analysis is fine in one sense, they fundamentally misunderstand America. They are, like most political scientists today, the children of Dr. Wilson and Dr. Dewey. They don't know that America was designed precisely not to be a democracy, and they don't know our Montesquieuian and Tocquevillian philosophy of moderation, and so their diagnosis and their remedies rest in part on amnesia and therefore in part on misunderstanding. What we need to recover now is that in the American political tradition and in the moderate Enlightenment philosophers who most deeply shaped our political tradition, both the Declaration and the Constitution, moderation is the spirit of our legal constitutional order. Constitutional politics implies moderate politics, that is, avoiding extremes both in ideas and action. And so the philosophy of moderation takes its clearest political expression in a complex and finely balanced constitutional order and a constitutional culture or spirit. To cite one example from our constitutional founding, it's no accident that the political virtue of moderation is invoked in the first and the last of the Federalist essays, number 1 and number 85. If anybody's seen the Hamilton musical, right? Federalist makes a brief appearance. I'm not going to sing. Now, some people might object that Hamilton, of all people, citing moderation, that means it must be empty as a political and philosophical concept. It's just slippery, merely rhetorical, implying that I am moderate and my opponents are extreme. My reply to that, it is precisely, and the musical captures this, it is precisely Hamilton as Publius that matters here. He's writing under the influence of the towering political moderate George Washington. Hamilton as Publius argues as a Washingtonian thinker for a constitutional order that balanced and reconciled several principles to achieve a greater political good, just as Washington himself balanced and reconciled his spiritedness, his ambition, his greatness on the one hand, with a commitment to equal natural rights and the rule of law on the other. Are there any fans of the musical here who know the soundtrack by heart? No, I haven't. Okay. So what's the song that Washington sings in the one last time, right? Have a drink with me, Alexander Hamilton. We're going to write the farewell address. Have one last time. It's about saying goodbye. It's about limiting his own political power. He's going to resign from political life. In that farewell address, for which Hamilton was the lead drafter, and also in the Federalist, Hamilton did his best work when moderated and elevated by Washington's influence. And so it makes perfect sense that he would invoke moderation in the very first opening argument essay of the Federalist and in the closing essay. This is an instance of what moderation meant at our constitutional founding, a principle or virtue with real meaning, not merely political mushiness or mere centrism or seeking compromise. I'll offer just a little bit more foundation before turning to the philosopher I mentioned in the title of this talk, Alexis de Tocqueville. This idea of moderation as a political and philosophical virtue goes back to the very first political scientist, Aristotle. It's at the foundation of the Western civilizational tradition more generally, as an intellectual and political quality that allows us to see and define what virtues are as such. Aristotle's definition of a virtue is a higher middle ground, avoiding and in between two extremes of human nature, extremes of politics. And so virtues and moderation itself are excellences of both individuals and of polities, and the two kinds of excellences influence each other. For Aristotle, the philosophical and political dimensions of moderation elevate or prize the adaptation of high principle to particular political circumstances through prudent judgment. His political science sees the statesman or the stateswoman as indispensable, making the judgment calls that defend or abide by principles of natural right in particular real circumstances. Moving forward to the 13th century, this was adopted by the Christian political tradition and in turn influenced several centuries later the moderate Enlightenment of the 18th century. The conception of moderation as principled but flexible avoidance of extremes, as seeking a higher middle ground. Thomas Aquinas emphasized this in the 13th century, defining the best form of government as a polity or mixed regime, based in democracy or popular consent in some way, but giving a very significant role for high offices held by elites who exercise prudent judgments and a moderating influence. This is the civilizational foundation for the American conception, now mostly forgotten, of moderation as a constitutional virtue. America particularly draws this from the moderate Enlightenment philosopher Montesquieu, and in the generations after our political founding, this view was reaffirmed and deepened by Montesquieu's great successor, Tocqueville. As Bob mentions, my remarks draw on a book I published a few years ago. It's just out in paperback, called Democracy in Moderation. I forgot to bring a copy. Show it to you. In which I argue that Tocqueville develops this philosophy of moderation and constitutional politics that had been forged about a century earlier by his fellow Frenchman, Montesquieu. And in the title art, Washington's not in the title of the book, but he's on the cover of the art. And it's a portrait that's in the Senate side of the Capitol, Senate wing, showing Washington with Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. In a way, the two extremes of political thought at the American founding, and Washington reconciling them. I also chose two epigraphs for the book to try and capture Montesquieu's explicit argument about a philosophy of moderation, and then Tocqueville's argument to develop this after the trauma of the French Revolution and the development of a democratic culture in America. So first, Montesquieu, from this enormous book called The Spirit of Laws, published in 1748, which was arguably the single most important book for our constitutional framers. Much more, Locke was important for the Declaration, but not exclusively important. But Montesquieu is much more important for the constitutional founding, for Blackstone, and therefore our ideas of law and the Bill of Rights, for example. So this is Montesquieu. I say it, and it seems to me I brought forth this huge work only to prove it. The spirit of moderation ought to be the spirit of the legislator. The political good, like the moral good, always is found between two limits or two extremes. A second epigraph is from Tocqueville, Democracy in America, first volume published in 1835 after he had visited America and observed. Tocqueville doesn't identify himself as a philosopher. He doesn't explicitly identify a principle of moderation, seeking this higher middle ground, but I think that's the spirit of this great book, Democracy in Moderation. So here's a quotation from the introduction to the book. This book is not precisely in anyone's camp. In writing it, I did not mean either to serve or to contest any party. And I think he means by that a philosophical school or party as well as a political party. I undertook to see not differently but further than the parties. And while they are occupied with the next day, I wanted to ponder the future. So my argument in the time I have remaining is that Tocqueville deepens Montesquieu's view of philosophical and political moderation, especially by noticing the fundamental and exceptional American balance between the spirit of liberty on the one hand and the spirit of religion on the other. Indeed, Tocqueville recommends this high balance or principled moderation to all liberal democracies because he's confident liberal democracy will spread. So all peoples who wish to be decent and free while also enjoying the new era of equality should look to this American achievement of moderation. So these two modern yet complex philosophers and a predominant spirit in America's constitutional founding emphasize moderation as informing the character or spirit of a people as well as constitutional complexities of federalism and separation of powers and non-democratic elections or selections for federal offices. This moderate spirit and moderate balanced constitutionalism were meant to refine and temper popular consent, precisely to save us from divisive and angry appeals to popular passions, to save us from radical or categorical demands, to save us from a polarized citizenry manipulated by demagogues. Tocqueville's philosophy is particularly needed today because he adapts the emphasis on moderation in both Montesquieu and the American founders. Given his recognition after the French Revolution and during Jacksonian America that democracy and the demand for equality were new and powerful phenomena, they could be made just but only if our political aim is democracy in a moderate way, or democracy in moderation. America and the liberal democracies modeled upon her should aim to strike the right balance among democracy's several defining principles, while also tempering its characteristic weaknesses or tendencies to extremes. Tocqueville's idea of moderation, well understood, guides us about the current political contest in front of us, whether it's domestic policy or foreign policy, but also about the manner in which we should study and debate particular policies. More generally, it guides us and warns us about the sustainability of the constitutional liberal republic as a whole. For America, this philosophical moderation considers our polity in one sense a democracy, as Tocqueville does in the title of his famous book. Yet to be sustainable as a free and egalitarian policy, America always has been more than democratic, and Tocqueville advises us to affirm this kind of complexity. He urges us, both for our theory and for our practice, to connect our current issues or debates, domestic or international, to the deeper philosophical, moral, civic, and religious resources that sustain not any one principle in our order, but the balance or blend of our principles. For example, Tocqueville advises us to consider the claims of liberty as well as equality, that we must preserve our basic social and political capital, especially our sense of religious belief, as well as pursuing progress or innovation. These deeper resources and this balance of principles comprise a balanced constitutional polity. But Tocqueville understands very well this complex constitutionalism is not automatically self-sustaining. It requires constitutional renewal through study and deep civic education, through civil debate, and through education for statesmanship. This need for a deeper civic education in substantive civic knowledge leads us to consider that another cause of our dysfunctional or bankrupt politics today is the imbalance, indeed, in some ways, the celebration of intellectual and political extremes in much of American higher education. The rise of kinds of orthodoxy on American campuses and universities, tilting in most institutions to the left, in some places tilting to the right, in turn shapes our broader discourse. For if our academic communities and debates about public issues on campuses are not marked by breadth and balance of study, but instead by self-selection into narrow schools and camps, then we should not be surprised that our broader public debates are not civil and fruitful, but are shrill and destructive. Since I'm in Boulder, I thought I would try this out. One resource for rediscovering a philosophical and political virtue of moderation is to notice environmentalist thinking and its emphasis, its effective persuasion of people to take seriously the idea of limits and sustainability. This includes limits to our ideas of progress, thus the need to temper our confident quest for what is new with concern for viable patterns of consuming resources. So some environmentalists might not like this, but I'll try it. A moral and political analog of this kind of thinking, of sustainability, is in the opening text of our Constitution, the preamble. We, the people, it suggests, are a sober and constitutionalized citizenry, for we do ordain and establish this legal political order in order to secure the blessings of liberty. And we do it not only for ourselves in any generation, but for our posterity. So I suggest we should adopt today's currency of sustainability to help us rediscover the deeper philosophical resource of moderation. The preamble to our Constitution, like our polity itself, encompasses a range of ends that don't easily fit together. They have to be balanced and reconciled. The entire Constitution was the product of vigorous debate that required, as Publius notes in the opening and closing of the Federalist, both advocacy of principle on the one hand and recognition on the other of alternative and competing principles, the capacity to modulate our rhetoric and to reconcile multiple views. If we cannot recover this capacity in the American polity and academy for finding balance, for identifying and avoiding extremes, and for reconciling principles in a high middle ground, then maybe we are doomed and we won't pass on this order to our posterity. But then we will have cheated them. Tocqueville, in particular, can be seen as a philosopher of moderation if we rediscover a now nearly forgotten causal chain, and I've been sketching it in my earlier remarks. First, that the 18th century French philosopher Montesquieu was the most important source of America's first political science, but also of the subsequent liberal global order that America helped to build, marked by gradually expanding commerce and peace. Montesquieu, as I've quoted to you, elevated moderation as the central principle of his political science to achieve more humane policies in domestic and international realms. First link. Second link, Montesquieu's deep influence is evident not only in the Federalist, but in, as I mentioned, the complex constitutionalism defended throughout that work, a Montesquieuan program to find balance and avoid extremes. But it continues the first debates of our first decades between the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, the Democratic Republicans that produced the Constitution and the Bill of Rights embody balance and reconciling of rival principles. Third link, Tocqueville draws upon all these understandings, seeks to endorse and deepen them. So it is no accident that among the most widely cited ideas in democracy in America is his chapter on what tempers or moderates the tyranny of the majority in the United States. It's a discussion of moderation, of helping democracy to avoid extremes. So to the extent that we now have forgotten moderation as Montesquieu and the founders and our great honorary American Tocqueville understood it, we don't understand ourselves, we don't understand the liberal global order that we helped to build based upon these principles, whether we seek to endorse them and defend them or to criticize them. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville expressed this philosophy of moderation more profoundly than any other modern thinker, and he deepened Montesquieu's version of it. He best comprehends three dimensions of moderation that we should recover. First, it's an intellectual virtue of Socratic and Aristotelian inquiry that seeks the truth by avoiding extremes or single-mindedness. So Tocqueville's moderation is a liberal and modern adaptation of the classical and medieval ideals of political and intellectual balance. Second, a political science featuring a complex constitutionalism and moderate liberalism, to include classical and medieval elements such as civic virtues, metaphysical religious belief, and a broader view of natural right beyond individual natural rights. Third, a due regard for statesmanship and principled prudence by those who study as well as practice politics. Tocqueville sought to moderate the radical Enlightenment not only by highlighting its disruptive effects leading to the French Revolution and sort of a wider war that France wanted to start on that basis, but also by discerning the more subtle but still dangerous consequences of radical Enlightenment thought for culture and thinking more broadly. This would explain why Tocqueville does not really pose as a philosopher and doesn't declare an abstract principle of moderation as Montesquieu had done. He doesn't declare any philosophical doctrine per se. Nonetheless, while he distances himself from philosophy, Democracy in America still borrows substantially from the great works of the philosophical tradition, and especially from Montesquieu, in the structure and spirit of laws and in the philosophy of moderation. So understanding Tocqueville as this kind of philosopher, avoiding intellectual extremes, finding the right middle ground for politics, with guidance from classical and medieval views of natural right and religion, all of this allows us to see how he deepens Montesquieu's philosophy. To adapt one of Tocqueville's famous phrases about enlightened self-interest or interest well understood, Tocqueville teaches us about moderation rightly understood. For the good of both the new democratic societies and any people who seek moral or intellectual greatness, modern philosophy needs moderating. Even the moderate Enlightenment philosophy of Montesquieu needs tempering through greater respect for religious belief and for the limits of narrowly rational inquiry. However, since Christianity, with its egalitarian spirit, is a source of modern democracy, the proper relationship between philosophy and democracy and religion is quite complicated. Tocqueville seeks to restore forgotten wisdom and perspective to the brashly progressive modern world, but he also affirms the basic truth and justice of the democratic era. The new political equality needs guidance from religious faith and metaphysical thinking more generally. And Tocqueville promotes these resources neither on cynically utilitarian grounds alone, nor by what might be the opposite extreme, emphasizing only devotional or sectarian faith. For Tocqueville, a reasonable, balanced view of human nature indicates that democracy will be its best only by moderating its self-worshipping tendencies, avoiding its tendencies towards such extremes as materialism and rationalism, and then elevating its gaze. Modern democracy will find its best self in moderation thus understood. Tocqueville initially develops this philosophy of moderation in Democracy in America by explaining how the Americans both embody moderation and have tendencies toward extremes, and how much Europe, and especially France, need to learn from the best of the American example. Tocqueville sees in America multiple foundings, or a complex political culture that later produces a legal constitutional founding as a federal republic. So the first founding, in a way, for Tocqueville is the Puritan Republicans, who balance liberty and religion through mores and culture as much as through laws and institutions. And then there's a second founding at the end of the 18th century by thinkers and statesmen, influenced by traditional English common law and the moderate Enlightenment, as well as by America's earlier founding, its Christian Republican blend. As a quietly philosophical work, Democracy in America is conscious of the trauma inflicted on France and Europe by the radical Enlightenment and extreme philosophical claims. While he notices flaws in America, he therefore sees much to admire in America, and he wants to broadcast this to Europe. This includes admiration for American statesmanship and prudent judgment, and for George Washington above all, explicitly praising him for his moderation. He also states that the Federalist should be known by statesmen in every country for its contributions to the political science of constitutional republics. So paradoxically, his view of moderation is more philosophical in one sense than Montesquieu's, because it places a greater emphasis on metaphysics and the need for religion and metaphysical inquiry. So in the time I have left, I can just offer a few more points in a sketch of how a philosophy of moderation is the guiding spirit of this great book, Democracy in America. This is evident in three broad points in the work. First, that he deepens Montesquieu's political science so that a political science will moderate and guide the new liberal democratic era. Second, his constitutionalism emphasizes balance, avoidance of extremes, and seeking a higher and reasonable middle ground. And then the third element that's partly present in Montesquieu, but much more emphatically present in Tocqueville, the higher aim of a new political science, evident in Tocqueville's praise for and his effort to rehabilitate metaphysics and ideas of natural right, and then religion, against the modern liberal democratic tendencies toward materialism and rationalism. He talks about the need of these higher kinds of thinking as good for the human soul. So given our current political anger down in the mud, I thought I would emphasize this last point, metaphysical and higher modes of thinking in Tocqueville's account of moderation, as a resource that he praised as providing deeper guidance, that as citizens and political thinkers we should cherish and restore the Western and Christian tradition of metaphysics, natural rights, and religion for the sake of our souls, as well as for healthier, higher politics. The paradox of all this about Tocqueville is that we know from his own letters that he intended to be made public is that he did not have a personal religious faith. He was not a confessing, believing Christian at the end of his life. His wife was a devout Christian, but he was not. So it's paradoxical that Tocqueville, as a philosopher, places such a direct emphasis on metaphysical philosophy and religious faith. No particular one religious faith. He talks about the advantages of Christianity, but he's not exclusively Christian in his recommendation. Tocqueville defends political and civic liberty, but he is bravely concerned with modern individualism and materialism. He thus recommends a selective restoration of ancient and medieval principles of religion and metaphysical philosophy to remedy these extremes of modern thought. The spirit and structure of Democracy in America convey a new political science that seeks to translate these older truths of ancient and medieval philosophy to a new world dominated by equality. These earlier resources will help to instruct the new world on its need for amelioration through elevation. He seeks to leaven liberal individualism and egalitarianism by restoring the higher potentiality of politics and civil society found in these earlier philosophies. A crucial element of this new moderation is his embrace of the basic reasonableness as well as the utility of Christian faith. He opens Democracy in America by emphasizing his concern that the new equality of conditions should remain a democratic form of liberty and not a democratic form of tyranny. It should be a kind of equality safe for nurturing of the natural greatness of man inherent in the soul. As I mentioned, he then deems the very point of departure for America itself the key to almost the whole work as a balance or a principle of moderation. It is that the Americans have succeeded in incorporating somehow into one another and combining and balancing two elements that are in conflict in every other form of politics he knows about: the spirit of religion on the one hand and the spirit of liberty on the other. He seeks to elevate the democratic soul by linking liberty and religion, but he also is critical of the opposing streams of Christian zealotry on the one hand. He's very critical of the Puritans for being puritanical at one extreme, and rationalist atheists on the other. He's generally worried, however, that religion in America is weakening in both Europe and America under the gains of modern philosophy and particularly modern natural science. He's worried that the divine notion of rights is disappearing. The Declaration of Independence says our rights come from the law of nature and nature's God. And he worries that this view is disappearing. One of the most striking efforts he makes in this argument is in Volume 2. It occurs in a pair of chapters that encourage governments to indirectly foster and buttress religious faith. One chapter is called How Religious Beliefs at Times Turn the Souls of Americans Toward Immaterial Enjoyments. They elevate us above the material. And in another chapter nearby, How in Times of Equality and Doubt, sort of rational skepticism, it is important to move back the objects of human actions, to think about eternity for the soul, not just immediate action. Here, Tocqueville clearly features a grand strategy of democracy and moderation, urging Democrats to find resources within their tradition so as to be the best of Democrats, even to rise toward republicanism and its more fully human life. He urges here what he expects will be, he says this explicitly, I think this will be a controversial point, but I'm going to state it anyway, that the politicians should act every day as if they believed in the immortality of the soul, conforming scrupulously to religious morality in great affairs. I think his model for this may have been George Washington, because in Volume 1, he emphatically praises Washington as a great man and explicitly cites John Marshall's biography of Washington. And he also quotes from and praises Washington's farewell address. So Tocqueville's new political science calls for citizens, and especially statesmen, educated in religious and constitutional principle, who can inculcate the moderate aims of ordered liberty and of the dignity of the soul's temporal and eternal destiny. Tocqueville seeks to restore an element of the deeper philosophy of our classical and medieval traditions, a need he diagnosed in Volume 2 when noticing that in the democratic era, thinking and language will abandon little by little the terrain of metaphysics and theology. So he's seeking to restore it. So now to close, some practical suggestions on what to do to recover from our current political extremism and dysfunction. In general, I think we should seek to restore intellectual space for appreciating both philosophical and political moderation. And so here we can say that the Center for Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy is doing its part. The next step would be more difficult, to restore in universities and schools a civic education that prepares public officials and other public figures to be statesmen and stateswomen, and not merely leaders. Or in Tocqueville's terms, as we just heard, to be so guided by high political principle, while also being effective as politicians, that we might see and admire a politician who is acting every day as if he or she believed in the soul's immortality. This is not utopia. Abraham Lincoln does this, right? Saying our constitutional order is an apple of gold, the Declaration of Independence, protected by a frame of silver, Constitution. And that's a paraphrase of the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. My most concrete and final suggestion, maybe the most controversial, is that we should limit direct participation in our elections, given the extremes of passion and polarization that we have seen this kind of democracy unleash. We have seen it elevate figures like candidate Sanders and candidate Trump. We would have to moderate our democratic self-worship and realize that it is damaging a free politics. And that would lead us to consider how we could limit, not do away with, but limit the role of direct primary elections. Think about it. These electoral contests and the threat of them have warped and polarized our politics, especially in the past 50 years. The noun, a primary, is now a verb. If you compromise or are seen to be moderate in any way, you will be primaried by the more extreme wings of your party. It's a constant threat. It makes legislating and policy compromises difficult. It rewards those who demonize the opposing party or who are at best constantly raising money to ward off primary challenges. Primary elections lead us directly into demagoguery, and the Federalist predicts that that would happen if we had direct democratic elections for every office. Now we demand not only direct democratic elections for every office, for the Senate and for the presidency as well as for the House and in all the state offices, but now we demand it twice to, in the first round, select who gets to run in the final round. Because any such idea of limiting direct democratic participation will be criticized as elitist or as favoring corruption and backroom deals in smoke-filled rooms, we would need to deliberate on how to remedy our current ills without bringing new unintended ills. The larger aims to be achieved by strengthening our political parties and some adult supervision in the parties, by letting party mechanisms and leaders play a greater role in shaping our elections and thus reducing our constant electioneering and constant fundraising and our polarizing rhetoric, these, I think, are worth the price. And if we did so, we might be able to restore these three elements now sorely lacking in our politics: moderation as a principle governing ideas and actions in public life, civility in disagreement, and commitment to a common good or public interest above our own chosen intellectual schools or our partisan views. So America's moderate liberal constitutionalism is not inevitably doomed. It still has exceptional ingredients for continuing its journey of developing a more perfect approximation of its high ideals. But our universities in particular need to rediscover our role in causing our current failures, and we need to recover the elements of the deeper and moderate civic education that our leaders and citizens need. Happy to take questions.
So I have to sort of, I think, disagree with this connection between universities, the role that they may play in being in sort of provoking illiberal tendencies, and the structure of congressional and electoral politics. Like, I mean, I don't think John Dewey made Newt Gingrich use C-SPAN to heighten partisanship. And so there might be something there. Newt Gingrich doesn't like people from Harvard or whatever, but like that seems like a jump between the structure of the university and whatever sort of things come out of that, and the kinds of structures that incentivize politicians to do things in electoral politics or in congressional politics or among the people who are elected.
Sure. Fair points. There's only so much blame you can place on two academics that I mentioned. Professor Woodrow Wilson, right, who explicitly writes about rewriting the constitutional order without amending it, right? And then John Dewey, right? Constant democracy, constant progress. But think about it. Newt Gingrich wouldn't care that the C-SPAN cameras are capturing him, even though he's speaking to an empty House chamber, and he's using volatile and emotional rhetoric, unless there was an electoral playing field where that would have an advantage. So to use primary elections within his own party to push toward an extreme, right? And then, sure, the House was designed for direct democratic election, but it was designed to be the only body. So now that same kind of, if you want to demonize Newt Gingrich, fine, that same kind of extreme rhetoric, right? You could think of Jesse Jackson or Bernie Sanders, or right? That's now in every elected office at every level. You can't get away from it in city councils, in city politics, let alone state houses, state senates, state governors, not only the House, but now the Senate and the presidency. So every office is open to that. So it's, the Federalist recognizes that that might be the character of House elections, and there might be demagoguery with direct election, but it was worth it because you wanted to have a broad democratic base of consent. Now we've opened every office to that. And so when new technologies come along that exacerbate our democratic tendencies toward short-term thinking and being emotional and being angry and being polarized, right? Social media, beyond what Newt Gingrich ever thought of, right? Now we have stripped all the moderating elements and defenses from it. So gerrymandering as well. I mean, that was around at the founding time. It's named after Elbridge Gerry, who was at the Constitutional Convention. He was a non-signer. But the effects of that kind of warping and cheating in politics are made worse if every form of politics is made more democratic, and there's constant campaigning, constant fundraising. So, yes.
So I'm a curious creative that lives here in Boulder, so I don't really have in-depth knowledge of the subjects, but I like to read. So if my question's naive, apologies. But I'm curious as to what extent the neoliberal economic order undermines the possibility of moderation in politics by prizing capitalist accumulation and individualism and competition over, say, I don't know, like a communitarian ideal where the rights of the individual can be protected at the same time while the virtues of community are adhered to. You talked a lot about religion and politics and constitutional democracy and moderation within it, but I feel like kind of the gorilla in the room is the economic order. And even Citizens United, as a decision that made the possibility of more capital being able to flow into the political system, is a direct example of the undermining of the type of moderation that Tocqueville may have sought.
Sure.
So how do we, taking into kind of the juxtaposition of our economic order being the opposite of moderation, particularly like Reaganomics, Thatcherism, so on and so forth, with this political ideal that's based on a bunch of normative claims that you just mentioned, how do we even begin to reorganize our system when the economic system seems to have supplanted any type of political?
Okay, so let me work backward. The money would only matter in politics if you had such a radically democratic, open electoral system of constant campaigning. Citizens United wouldn't matter as much if you had a different electoral landscape. So by party policies and state laws and our broader political culture, we have doomed ourselves to constant fundraising and money having an outsized influence. So we should instead of blaming the symptom, we should get back to the cause. As far as political economy, having thrown most of my own discipline, political science, under the bus, why not toss the economists underneath as well? They're even worse, right? So Adam Smith wrote 2 books as a professor of moral philosophy in Scotland. His first and his last book was a book of moral philosophy called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In between first writing it and making the final revisions shortly before his death to A Theory of Moral Sentiments, he wrote the book that most of us would know, right? An inquiry about the wealth of nations, causes, wealth of nations. So for Smith, as a protege of Montesquieu, who advocates these ideas of a free political economy and commerce and the good international effects of commerce, a sort of a commercial peace theory, Smith is not thinking like a Machiavellian economist would today, thinking only about math and models, no moral understanding, no study of Adam Smith or Marx or Ricardo or any of the great debates. It's just math, basically math and models. That's not who Adam Smith is. That's not who Alexander Hamilton was when he was founding a free political order in a new nation state, which he thought would be liberating. For Alexander Hamilton, it was, I think the musical gets at this. It's not just, hokey. It would allow anybody to rise, and it would help to doom slavery, to have a free labor economic order that was based on Adam Smith's principles and not having the government regulate the economy and economic activity to such an extent that it was an oligarchy. So, fair point that we've lost much of our political, economic, moral understanding in those broader senses, and I'm all in favor of getting back to that, to seeing what are the strengths of a free market economic system and what are the advantages of some other alternatives. But we don't do a lot of that in our universities. We certainly don't do it in political science departments. We don't really do it in economics departments. Right? Maybe philosophy departments might teach more of those sorts of ideas than other departments would. Another, yes?
Why do you think that extremism is so attractive to Americans right now?
I think in a way extremism is always attractive, right? I mean, these are what the Greek myths are about. This is what the Garden of Eden is about in the Bible. Be a god. Greatness. And so there's a tendency in our nature to, go too far with a good thing. Take a good thing too far. My wife loves to teach, always loved to teach the Oedipus plays, right? Greatness or ambition taken too far to the point of self-destruction. So the American founders read all of that, the Greek and Roman classics. They knew the Bible very well. They knew Shakespeare. And in fact, those sources are cited in the Federalist, not Locke or Machiavelli or Hobbes, not once, right? But they cite Plutarch, and they cite Shakespeare, and they, are relying upon a wider and deeper tradition that knows about, said, well, a good bet is human nature is this way, and politics will go this way, unless we do the following. So that's the simple answer. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
So speaking of the laboring classes, you have the videographer. Yeah. You have a question?
That was a weird comment, but I'm curious, do you think that the founding fathers and the people that you're talking about who were philosophizing back in 1740 whatever could have envisioned the America of today? And do you think that the rules that were put in place by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are sustainable given the changes that have occurred with the population in the United States? I mean, it seems like if only rich white men vote, it's very easy to play by those rules. But now you're talking about limiting the democratic process. Who do you intend to cut out? Are we going back to a time when only rich white men get to play politics, or what? How are we going to do this?
No, first of all, I think if you understand the American founding era as a series of debates from the 1770s to at least 1801 and beyond, with Jefferson's election, the Democratic Republican Party. Within that, there's an amazing prescience about what America could be or could become, both for good or for ill. Technology and continental expansion and the bad things, what to do with slavery, treatment of the Native Americans, that's there, but also a space on the earth for ambition and industry, and to do things that have never been done before in human history for immigrants. Right? So Lincoln is always my guide in these sorts of situations. Lincoln thought the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights were pretty good, and we ought to stick with it. And he came from nothing, literally. He came from dirt. So he may have been white, but he was opposed to slavery, tried to figure out how to get rid of that or box that in. He thought that was the best bet for fairness and equality. What I'm proposing is not a return to smoke-filled rooms, backroom deals, a few white men controlling. I'm just talking about a principle of seeing the good idea of direct primary elections going too far, to a degree of self-destruction. And so how would we temper it? So, for example, the Democratic Party still has superdelegates in their presidential election process. And I've seen reports that they want to do away with it. The one moderating adult supervision element left in the Democratic Party's president, right? The Republicans have done away with it, and I haven't heard anybody in the Republican National Party leadership talking about bringing it back, even after having their party hijacked by somebody through his expertise in being a demagogue. So I'm just talking about some small steps to limit the capacity for demagogues and money to dominate our politics. Yeah.
Sorry. You talk a lot about like democratizing the nation and how we do so much direct democracy now, but I can't help but think that, okay, let's take a few steps. Let's say we take away that senators are no longer directly elected. Wasn't it that the state legislators chose them before that happened? So let's
So that was a
now-
constitutional amendment, right?
Yeah, well, let's say nowadays that senators, we pass another amendment to say, okay, let's go back to that. And now the House, the House of each state elects their senators. I personally don't see how that's going to stop more radicalized individuals from getting into those positions of power, seeing as the people who are in the positions of power to put those people in power can be just as radical or want their more radicalized, more right or left people in those positions as well. And you going back to saying, well, if we then another point, you're saying if we take away more of these direct elections, we won't have to deal with things like Citizens United because there won't be as much money, there won't be as radical people. Isn't that only going to put more focus on fewer individuals? So increase the amount of money you have to raise for those individuals and say have more power in that capacity? Because then they get more power to decide who gets into those other positions. So then, would you have more money going into their elections? And at the same time, that's not going to stop the primaries from happening, which are what cause those radical individuals to be nominated for their parties in these elections anyway. So what would you say to that?
Great complicated question. In part, I'm just drawing on historical memory. We used to have parties functioning a different way. And I would go out on a limb and say parties used to be less polarizing and more responsible. So what we need is a political scientist at Dartmouth, Russ Muirhead, who wrote, who wrote a book a few years ago about parties, political theorist, making the argument, it's not that we don't have enough partisanship, we don't have enough of the right kind of partisanship, responsible partisanship, from parties as civic associations, local to state to national, that stand for certain principles, but also vet and elevate the people who lead as you go up the line. So that used to happen. On the other hand, so that's I'm not thinking. I don't think I mean to be thinking in utopian ways, right? But just going back to solid historical experience. But I also think it's utopian to think about overturning constitutional amendments. So I'm not advocating direct election of senators be overturned, because passing constitutional amendments is, like it's a meteorite. It's a lightning strike. Very, very hard to do. It's not prudent to think that way. So what other practical measures could we take? There was a time in American politics when there was less focus on constant campaigning, less focus on electioneering, less focus on, therefore, constantly needing to raise money to constantly be electioneering. It's not that there wasn't electioneering and campaigning, there wasn't money. There was just much less of it. And there was space, there were pauses. Right? The civic culture, as well as the laws, would say there's a campaign, there's an election, then the election's over, and there's space to govern. Then there's another election, right? And that's why the offices in the federal government were designed that way. 2-year terms for the House, 6-year terms for the Senate, right? So always 2/3 of the Senate had at least 4 years before they had to face an election, right? And it gives space to learn, to argue, to compromise, to reflect, to find some reasonable high common middle ground. So those are the conditions I'm trying to bring back. I can talk afterwards. So, sure. Actually, go to the 1, 2, 3.
Me and then your wife.
And I'll try and be brief now because we're near the end of my time.
You're suggesting that polarized citizenry and polarized politics, which hurts everybody. You're suggesting it's a downward spiral. Nobody's winning. But yet there's all these forces, very clearly, all these forces who are encouraging this trend from all sides. So there are forces who really believe that that they, who benefits from this downward spiral? Somebody obviously does, so they wouldn't be pushing it.
No, fair point. Yeah. Yeah, I guess the iceberg benefited from sinking the Titanic. I mean, there's somebody who benefits, and our media seems to be benefiting from it. The people who run political campaigns and raise money seem to benefit from it. The few demagogues who get to be in the gladiatorial demagogic contests, but sure, there are some people who benefit, but in a sort of sick way, right? It's like Greek tragedy. So the common good is not a seriously debated, discussed. I mean, there are some philosophers who take seriously, there are a few people who take seriously those kinds of ideas, that there can be a common good that arises from a free, liberal, democratic, constitutional, Republican politics, which is not simply majoritarian, but that there are larger common principles. That's what I mean by all of us benefiting. And there's also the question I brought up of sustainability, right? So benefiting not only the current generation, but our posterity. So, yeah.
A lot of the solutions that you're suggesting are deeply antithetical to the way probably most of us are thinking. More religion, less democracy, go back to the founding documents, teach civics in schools. Most of those things are very different to the way most of the liberal intelligentsia thinks. So the one place where I think there's a little connection is this idea of sustainability. I think that the environmental movement is one place where some of your ideas might connect to what most people think. So I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on how that could work.
Well, I actually think there's a broader appeal to some of these ideas if you phrase them the right way. I might not be the best spokesman for them, but if you think of figures like Washington and Lincoln and Martin Luther King, right? They figure out how to use religion in a unifying way. Washington almost never refers to Christianity or Christ or Jesus. Lincoln figures out at the time how to make the best arguments for pulling out of civil war, making sure the right side wins, and then healing and restoring. And then Martin Luther King using religion. In fact, Peter Beinart, a liberal progressive journalist, wrote an article in the Republic, it must be a year ago now, called Breaking Faith. You should look it up, it's fascinating. He argues that liberal, secular progressives like himself maybe went too far with this idea that religion is a cause of conflict and culture in America, because the three most angry forces in the 2015-2016 cycle were the most secular: Trump, Bernie Sanders, and Black Lives Matter. And so maybe which had explicitly criticized the older sort of Christian civil rights view. So the right way of framing them could suggest there's a broader appeal. Well, I'd be glad to think more about how the sustainability to make that argument about placing limits. If we think we have to place limits on how we think about cars and gasoline use, why couldn't we? Which we love, Americans love cars and we love to burn fossil fuels. Why couldn't we think about ways to moderate or limit the degree of primary elections and how they direct democratic elections for all offices? Right? Couldn't we moderate or modulate? Couldn't we come up with compromises that were bipartisan? If we can do it with environmental regulations that were bipartisan back in the day, Republican as well as Democratic, couldn't we realize to perpetuate our political order? Lincoln's first great political speech is about perpetuation of our institutions. Yeah.
I'll ask the
last question, right?
I'm very sympathetic to your argument and agree. But is there a danger, based on history, going too far in the other direction? For instance, one of the worst of the old rules was the two-thirds rule that operated in the Democratic Party until 1948, that essentially kept racial integration off the table
Jim Crow, right.
in American politics. And how do you balance restoring the adults without freezing out fundamental issues and even addressing injustices? And that experience suggests it's not as easy as it seems to do that.
You know, I'm thinking of the videographer's question, you know, what, am I looking for the return of white males? No. So how about a basic rule in the presidential primary nominating process of either party? You must have been a member of this party for X number of years, decades. It is the presidency, right? Bernie was not a Democrat. Donald Trump was not a Republican. Why couldn't you just have a basic rule? If you are going to try to take our label, the ideals that this party stands for and this civic association, you would have had to have shown, okay? And then you would have had to hold some, so Bernie would meet this threshold if he were a Democrat, but he wasn't. You would have to have been elected to some other level of offices before you get to be president of the United States or a United States senator, right? To show that you have been around and you have a record that other Republicans or other Democrats have seen and vetted, rather than sweeping in as the great demagogue of the moment, who's able to seize the political climate and manipulate it in just the right way. So those are just some basic qualifications. There are qualifications for office in the Constitution, and then the parties used to have, in effect, qualifications for office by vetting people through service and commitment. So that's my idea.
Please
Yeah.
give Paul a great hand. What a great presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you.